Ballad of Buster Scruggs was just released on Netflix this weekend and was directed by the Coen Brothers. The movie is a compilation of 6 different stories, all set in the Wild West of the 19th century. The first of these stories is about Buster Scruggs. He is an outlaw with almost superhero-like abilities. He is able to get himself out of almost any situation with a calm ease. The next segment starred James Franco as a bank robber, and for the entirety of this segment, I kept waiting for it to be tied back into Buster Scruggs' story, but it never was. So I kept watching. It was entertaining. I was like, okay, I guess maybe it'll take a few stories for them to be connected. We'll see what happens next. So each of these stories were violent, but riddled with dark humor and a sense of not taking themselves too seriously. But the third segment was very dark in tone. It starred Liam Neeson as a man who traveled from small town to small town with another man who had no arms and legs. They would set up a stage in these little towns, and the limbless man would recite stories, and a crowd would gather, and then they'd collect a donation from the crowd after these stories had been read, which I guess was basically like a movie to them. I'm not going to spoil anything in any of these stories, but this was by far the bleakest of them all. And again, it did not connect to any of the other stories. So, the fourth story was about an old prospector and his struggle to find gold. And it was by this point that I realized none of these stories were connected. They each had their own little story to tell. It didn't have anything to do with the bigger picture. It was just its own thing. And at that point, I started to understand the movie more. While I was entertained throughout all these previous stories, it took me a while to really get into the feel of this movie. And once I realized what was going on, I was really able to get into it. The fifth story was the longest and probably the most like a movie. It was probably my favorite one. It followed a brother and sister as they traveled with a group of others in covered wagons to Oregon. Because this one was longer, I felt the Coens were able to give us more character development, which made me more invested in the story. But even in the shorter segments, the Coens are able to tell us a lot about these characters, and some of them barely even speak a word, which is just excellent writing. The sixth and final chapter was about a group of strangers traveling together in a stagecoach. The entire segment is basically just dialogue between the 5 of them. And it felt the most like a Coen Brothers movie, with its sharp, witty, philosophical dialogue throughout. But I also found it to be the weakest of all 6. It didn't have a definite end to its story like the others did. And it might have made it even worse that it was the last story. And to be fair, pretty much every Coen Brothers movie seems to end pretty abruptly, but in this particular movie, it was almost too abruptly. All 6 had their own very distinct versions of the Wild West. And I don't know how accurate they were, but the aspects of life that they show in the film really fascinated me. It fascinated me to see how similar, yet how different, life was for these people 150 years ago. Because they focus on aspects of life that we don't often see in historical movies like this. It goes without saying for a Coen Brothers movie, but the cinematography was one of the standouts. Each segment looked distinct from one another in its setting, yet they all take place in the Wild West. In the hands of other directors, each segment could have just easily taken place in the desert or Old West towns, but I really liked how the Coens delved into every area of the West to give each segment its own look and feel. Maybe it was just me, guys, but the marketing campaign for this movie with the trailer and the posters made it seem like each of these stories would connect somehow. And I'm really glad they didn't do that and made for a much more inventive and unique film. And I really liked how each segment was written in this style of an old-timey folklore type way. This is the style of story that would have been told during the time frame the movie is set. This movie has got humor, action, romance, drama, fun, adventure, a darkness, a lightness, and even a few musical numbers. All of these aspects of the film can make it seem a little bit uneven, but the fact that it was split up into its different segments made it all okay for me. It didn't bother me. They stood on their own, but I can see why some people would feel this film felt a little uneven. Like any movie, there's some good parts, there's some bad parts. But this one, being split up into 6 different stories, seemed to vary a lot more than others. There were certain parts I really enjoyed. In fact, I really enjoyed most of it. But there were other aspects that just didn't really work very well for me. Some of the music in the first segment, the ending of the last segment, as I've already explained. Some of them felt like they could maybe be a little bit longer. But all that being said, I don't really have any cons with it. There are parts I didn't really like, but I don't think they're intrinsic to the movie necessarily. That being said, I don't really have any cons to the film. The only thing would be that I would change the title because it's really misleading. It's not The Ballad of Buster Scruggs. That is one of the 6 stories that's being told. I really don't know why it was called that. I guess it might have been a marketing technique, but I just feel it's a misleading title. Each story had a sense of meta, hyperbole, and pulp that made for an interesting, entertaining new spin on the Western genre. During the last segment, one of the characters in the stagecoach says something like, "We like characters in stories who are similar to us, yet different from us at the same time." This kind of sums up the movie. It was just a collection of stories about characters we could relate to, yet they lived maybe more exciting lives than us, or we could feel morally superior to them in certain ways. And it never reaches a point of sheer greatness, but it is one of the most unique movies I've ever seen. It's definitely one of the best Netflix movies I've ever seen. It's memorable, and I think it has a lot of good replay value to it. The more I think about it, the more I enjoy it, and my score might go up as time goes on and as I rewatch it. But for now, I'm going to give The Ballad of Buster Scruggs a 7.5 out of 10. Totally recommend checking it out, guys. Let me know what you think of The Ballad of Buster Scruggs in the comments below. And please make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you for my next review.